I'd like to return to an inflammatory issue that you mentioned earlier, which is whether or not there is such a thing as a Palestinian. And I think this is resonant with the discussion we had about, or what you were saying about indigeneity. But on the pro-Israel side, I have quite recently Noah Tishby in mind, whose book Israel, I think it's called Israel, A Guide to the Most Misunderstood Country on Earth, but I might be wrong. She questions the historical existence of a Palestinian people and claims that you cannot trace them back to any of the tribes that were extant around the historical times when Israel was there. And then, of course, there are continuing arguments and debates over whether or not Palestine was empty or just sparsely populated before 1948, which is very difficult for me to weigh in on or form opinions about just as a non-historian, because you can have two very prominent historians. So I have Benny Morris in mind. I have Norman Finkelstein in mind, where they're both citing sources apparently doing very rigorous investigations and coming to completely opposite conclusions about whether or not Palestine was in fact heavily populated and the land was being used before the Zionist movement went underway. But let me ask you how you think about Palestinians as a people and what substantiates their claim to the land, given what we were just discussing about property rights.
Well, let's start with, I think, two pretty incontestable facts. I think, maybe people will contest even these. I think it's pretty incontestable that 750,000 Palestinians were expelled in 1948 from their homes. What Constantine Zorayak, the Lebanese historian, called the Nakba, or the catastrophe. I don't know if anybody contests that 750,000 people were expelled from their homes. That's one number. Let's assume that that's a number that everybody accepts, okay? Now, second, I think it's pretty widely acknowledged. If you look at the Israel state's documentation, it's pretty well acknowledged that when the state of Israel was established in 1948, the Jewish population in the state was 630,000 people. So, 750,000 people expelled, and the Jewish population in 1948 was 630,000 people. I think that's except these two facts are correct, which I think is understood to be true, we're in an interesting starting point. Because the Jewish population then, after the expulsion, is about 120,000 less than the people expelled. So it's not a huge number of people at that time. If you look at the population now, in the millions, it is pretty clear that both the Jewish and Palestinian populations could have lived together. Excuse me. Could have lived together. There was enough room for both to live there, to build a project that was genuinely secular and not an ethno-religious state. You'll remember that the founders of Israel were in fact not keen to use Israel to found a Jewish state, which is the name of the book by Theodor Herzl. Many of them were quite secular in their own orientation. Sorry. And they didn't want to found a Jewish state per se. That's why there's an ambiguity in Israel, and that's why there continues to be a fight between, on the one side, the more religious sections and some of the secular sections, about what family law should be and so on. If it were strictly a Jewish state, then Jewish law would prevail and there wouldn't be space for, secular sorts of discussions. Okay. So demographically, it's not that there's no room there at that time in 1948. You cleared out 750,000 and you have a population 630,000. Okay. Now, let's go back. Who was cleared out? Who were they? There is a sentiment says, well, they were just Arabs and they were cleared out. So let's just assume they were generic Arabs. Let's leave it at that. Still, 750,000 people and their children have, through a UN resolution, 194, Resolution 194, have the right to return to their homes. That is enshrined in international law. So whatever you want to call them, they have a right to return to their homes or return to their territory. May not be to the exact home, because remember, it doesn't specify in the resolution. They have a right to return. Does it say right to return to their own home? It's not actually very precise. But whatever you call them, they have a right to return. So why are you denying? I'm now talking to those who are opposed to this discussion going in this direction. Why are you denying international law? You're not permitting the people who are expelled. I don't think anybody doubts the expulsion. Why aren't you denying the right to return? Okay, so that's one. That's got nothing to do with whether they are Palestinian or not. Okay, that's the basis of Resolution 194, a United Nations resolution. It has the status of international law, and it specifically says those 750,000 people have a right to return, whatever you call them. And that has not been obliged. So in that way, Israel is already in violation of international law. Full stop. Secondly, what does it matter what they call themselves? I mean, what does it matter? Let's say they call themselves Palestine. Going back and saying that nothing like Palestine existed is now a debate of the ancient world. And it's a debate which I've already said is not the best place to have this conversation, right? We go back to the ancient world. My God, what are you starting in terms of precedents? All European descendants should leave the United States and Canada, and Mexico and everywhere in South America. All of you should go home because you don't have a right to this land. I mean, this historical precedence argument, how far back do you go? So the debate about, there's no such thing called Palestinian, going back to the ancient world, that the names of the tribes and so on, to my mind is specious, because that's only an important discussion if you want to have a debate about, 79 AD or whatever, right? If we're going to go back all the way. But that opens a very serious problem. And again, that's the earlier problem we talked about. When do you start these discussions about who belongs where and who is entitled to what? Let's just go back to the 19th century. Well, in the 19th century, there were people who called themselves Palestinians. And we have lots of evidence. In fact, even the Balfour Declaration uses the word Palestine. British maps say Palestine. The Ottomans called it Palestine. So at some point in human history, Palestine comes into existence. It is now in existence. So the debate about the historical, necessity of the Palestine is ridiculous. I mean, let me ask you a question. There's no evidence of the United States of America before 1776, right? I've never seen the word United States of America used before 1776. The term American is a specious term. Amerigo Vespucci didn't exist in prehistory or even in early history. So that means people should stop calling themselves Americans, and there should no longer be something called the United States of America. There's no Mexico, okay? I mean, this argument is ridiculous. There's an element of it. Now, interestingly, this argument is not ridiculous if you remain within the tunnel of the debate around Palestine and Israel. Inside the narrow tunnel of this debate, these debates and arguments seem real, if you understand what I mean. They've taken on the status of serious issues. In my opinion, once you comparativize these debates, they are ridiculous, as I've just shown you. This is a ridiculous issue. To debate whether Palestine is real is super dumb. Because then you could say, for instance, forget the United States. That's an easy one, right? That's a really easy one because it has such a recent history. But let's take much earlier places. Let's take China. China is a recent phenomenon. China was created by the national liberation struggle against the Japanese and against the Kuomintang. It was in that long struggle from the 1920s onward that modern China was built. Territorial China was established. You could make claims to the past. Modern India. There was no modern India before the freedom struggle. The freedom struggle unites British territories with the old princely states and draws the boundary of India. India is a modern construction. Germany is, for God's sake, a modern construction. It was brought together by Otto von Bismarck. Germany, before there was a bunch of disparate principalities and baronies and all kinds of odd feudal ducks. Okay? It doesn't exist before the 1870s. So this particular debate can only be entertained if the rest of the world vanishes and we only talk about the so-called Israel-Palestine dispute. If you take it out of the narrow, suffocating sewer in which these disputes takes place, bring it into the bright sunshine of the whole world, right? These are ridiculous discussions. I mean, for somebody, a grown person with a brain who has read any kind of logical system, you don't have to take formal logic for this, okay? You just have to have some basic intelligence, will understand that to say that the people don't exist when they say we exist is ridiculous. They say we exist, you say no, you don't exist. That is at the level of a Monty Python debate. That is not serious,